This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
Well, welcome to Food Truths. Today's guest is Steve Lang, Dr. Steve Lang, to be more specific. He's the Vice President of Science and Technology for the aptly named California Cultured, a food technology startup based in Sacramento, California. California Cultured is producing cultured cocoa, chocolate, and other cacao-based products, all without needing to grow any of the plants that you would normally need. It is an extremely fascinating topic, and I can't think of a better person to explain the concept of cultured cocoa better than Dr. Lang here. And full disclosure, Steve and I know each other from our past. We'll get to that, but it's a pleasure to have you on the show, Steve.
Likewise. Always good to talk with you, Eric.
Well, let's get into it, because I have so many questions about cultured food in general, and you have lived many lives in this world. So when we talk about cultured food, we often refer to meat, poultry, seafood, yeast, bacteria, things like yogurt, bread, beer. Those are fermented cultured things. But here, I think the fascinating part of this is that California Cultured is growing cacao products in a space that's very far distant from the tropical environment that would normally be associated with cocoa production. So if I've had this right, you're growing plant cells directly in your production facility, and to an extent skipping the whole growing a tree part in the process. So it's kind of like cultivated meat, but you're only growing the part that you need of the plant. Is that accurate? Or why don't you just take us through like what is actually happening?
Sure. No, that's absolutely accurate. And then, what we're doing here at California Cultured is really crafting real and sustainable cocoa powder with functional benefits without growing the entire tree and waiting the years, and also the negative externalities of traditional agriculture impacting the planet. So we are, basically taking cells, very much like what we do in cultivated meat, cells from the animal or the plant, and growing them in a lab. And that is essentially it in a nutshell. And it's saying that, yes, we're producing exactly the same cells that the cocoa bean would produce. And I'll get into the details on how we do it. But the big point is that plants are really amazing, and they have some really nice advantages over animal cell culture. And this will be one of the themes that I come back to, is that I think that we can innovate in our plant cell culture advances that will then help us get to the cultivated meat inflection point that will really make us move this food system forward. So to take a step back, what we do in plant cell culture is very analogous to animal cell culture, where we would take a biopsy from an animal or a traditionally farmed animal and then grow those cells in a lab. In cellular agriculture, plant cell culture, we do exactly the same thing, except we call it an explant, and it could be any part of the plant that we can take and give it the right nutrients and regulatory signals and induce that cell or those cells in that explant to grow into new cells that can become a totally new plant. So every part of the tissue is being regenerated from a single cell, which is an amazing capability of plant cells that animal cells don't have. So that's called totipotency. And what we do then is essentially we take those cells and put them on agar plates, on plates, and those are called calli. And they'll look like little clumps of tan-colored cells. And we can screen through those cells and look for the cells that have the phenotypes and the growth characteristics that we're interested in. And then that is essentially becoming our seed bank. And from there, it's the start of production. And it's very analogous to the tried and true processes of biopharmaceuticals, as well as then cultivated meat, where we basically inoculate nutrient broth that has all the components that the cells need to survive with a few cells. And we give it more and more volume as those cells exponentially grow to develop more biomass. And that's called scaling. So we'll essentially go with a small inoculum in a small vessel and scale it up to thousands of liters, if you will. And that just takes time as the cells continuously grow. So one of the great things about this is that then you get into a production phase whereby within 7 days once you inoculate your final bioreactor. And a bioreactor is essentially, a tank that is providing the gases and the nutrients and the mixing necessary for cells to survive. Um, they will grow exponentially, and they'll convert all those nutrients in the tank that we give them in our media to biomass, into the nutritious material that we want it to convert then into food. And so after about 7 days, they'll go into lag phase, and we start the harvesting process, which is essentially for our first product, which is a cocoa powder. And I'll describe it a little bit more in detail. We take the slurry from the biomass or the bioreactor and dewater the cells. So we remove all the spent media, and we're left with the biomass that was generated from that media. And that is our cocoa powder. So we essentially dewater, dry it, mill it down to about 100 microns, which is what was typically done with traditional cocoa powder, and then we package it. The beautiful thing about this first product of ours is that this is a high flavanol cocoa powder. So it has a higher level of this compound that we know is a bioactive and important in human health, anti-inflammatory, cardiovascular improvements, um, that we can, from our processes, produce more flavanol and essentially produce healthier cocoa and coffee products by supplementing this flavanol into those as an ingredient. And so our goal is then to take the biomass that we've had, and we can take the raw biomass that's straight from the bioreactor, that has been dried, of course, and supplement foodstuffs with it to increase the flavanol contents to give that health benefit. But we could also then treat it as a traditional cocoa powder, which then gets further processed through an additional fermentation with yeast and bacteria to develop flavors, as well as a roasting process to break down some of those flavor compounds into more mature chocolate flavors to create chocolate or any chocolate products. The caveat there is that we kind of break down some of those flavanol compounds in the product. And so it becomes much more like a traditional commodity cocoa powder. So what we're thinking about is that this single bioprocess is producing for us two different products, one with a high flavanol content, and the other is more of a traditional cocoa powder uh, makeup, but nutritionally very similar otherwise.
So let me see if I get this right, because a lot of the people listening are not going to be bioprocess engineers like you and kind of me sometimes. So you take a part of the plant, and not from the seed. You actually said the seed bank, but like you're not actually growing seeds or parts of seeds. You're growing parts of the adult or juvenile plant or something, right?
It is from
Like
a
you're
seed,
it
a
is from the seed.
cocoa.
Okay.
Yep, yep. So we've taken essentially the processes to get or source the cocoa pod from the USDA farm. We sterilize the outside of it. We open it up, and then aseptically take those explants from the beans themselves, and we know what the material is, or what those cells are coming from, and they're coming from the seed coat. Um, so that's the important part. Yeah, sorry, I overlooked that.
Okay, so we're taking the cells from the seed coat of the cocoa pod, and for those
Right.
again, maybe if you don't know, like again, your chocolate comes from these cacao beans, and it's actually part of this of the seed pod. And you can tell me all the specifics, Steve.
Right.
But we don't eat like the tree bark, like cinnamon. We eat parts of that have been dried, and sometimes fermented, but basically roasted parts of the seed pod. Correct?
Yes.
Traditionally,
Right. Right.
and
And
these plants traditionally require like a much more warm tropical climate, as I understand
absolutely.
it.
Right. So
And you're doing this all inside of a building in lovely Sacramento, California.
that's right. Yep. So yeah, that's the other part of this is that the range restriction for cacao is very limited around the equator, and largely enjoys very humid and hot environments to grow, and that is typically tropical rainforests. So a lot of the tropical rainforest is being cut down or to go to farming. Not always cacao, but that's a proportion of it.
And so you literally are growing almost like the nucleus of the plant, these
Hmm.
embryonic cells, because that's what the seed is. And you bring up this concept of totipotency, and I think it's such a fascinating concept. And in we do have totipotent cells in, let's say, humans and what other
Right.
mammals, but it is a tiny fraction of our lifetime. In fact, I think it's up until the eight cell stage when we were one cell, then two, then four, then eight. Each one of those cells could make an entire new organism, and that's how sometimes you get identical twins.
Right.
And but in plants, you can go much longer. It sounds like each cell then can make its own complete, organized, you call it cali.
Right.
Got it.
But that's an undifferentiated cell, and those cells can still be differentiated into an entire plant, as I understand it. And this is again getting to uh, uh, the fact that I'm not a plant scientist and I'm only learning. So I may have some mistakes there, but we'll figure it out.
That's part of being a scientist. We both
Yeah,
are
exactly.
struggling. We struggle our way through it until we find a better place on the other side. Um, so take me through then how how do you go from, I mean, I understand the notion of growing a cell and growing a lot more of them and then using those to produce something, but I guess it's one thing for me to imagine growing a muscle cell and making more muscle cells, but are you growing a chocolate cell and then growing more chocolate cells? What is it you're actually growing that then converts into cacao? Like, what is it, a specific cell type, or like what makes it special?
It makes it special is essentially the flavors and the bioactive compounds that we get from the final product. So, yeah, it is not a single cell isolate like what we do in biopharmaceuticals, where we are very much interested in making sure that only a single cell is producing the product. This is more of a collection of cells coming from an explant that all have the same phenotype and growth characteristics that leads to then the flavor profiles that we can get out on the other side once we turn it into a product.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, in case you didn't know, also a lot of the antibodies and vaccines and things that you get are produced in a very very homogeneous a group of cells that
Right.
ideally are not very different from each other. So that makes a consistent product.
Exactly. Yeah, most biopharmaceuticals are only produced from two or three different cell lines.
We should talk about that in a second because, as is very intoned, Steve is a biomedical scientist in his training and has worked in the biopharmaceutical industry for most of his career up until recently,
Right.
until we crossed paths at Upside Foods doing cultured meat. Um, and I mean, I have so many questions around the notion of biopharma into food. We'll get there. But before we depart from just like the production process, and I guess the question really comes down to that probably everyone's listening going, why? Why bother
Mhm.
with cultured cocoa powder? Like, why even bother? Yes, the high flavanols, that's antioxidants and potentially, but like, why bother learning to do this process and spend venture capital dollars to do it?
Well, I think, yeah, uh, the things that I come back to, and the reason I get motivated for this work are three reasons, which are the what I see as humans' greatest challenges right now, which is food security, sustainability, and health. And the work that I'm doing here, and I'll kind of backtrack into this, is that I feel like is the work that we're doing at California Cultured is impacting all of those things, those three things specifically, on some very fundamental levels by innovating and developing some new technology that I think will be beneficial not only to producing food, but then also maybe cultivated meat and biopharmaceuticals in the future as we develop new processes to be able to really scale and produce cocoa powder in the beginning, coffee maybe next, cocoa butter after that, and eventually, cultivated meat in a really efficient and tasty way all the way down the road. So I think this is a spear, is the pointy end of the spear of innovation. And because it's a simpler model system, and it's also been a little bit neglected, whereas a lot of attention and funding has gone towards cultivated meat and biopharmaceutical. Um, Very little has been spent in the cell culture arena, which is I think a huge miss for us because we can get so much more because it is a simpler process and it has advantageous attributes to it that allow it for really having an impact on the environment and our current food system.
Yeah, I think that's something that many people don't realize. And I think as a parent, if you work in some of these spaces in innovation, it's not always readily apparent how two fields might relate or how they might help each other or
Hmm.
complement each other. That might be not obvious, but I think there's more overlap than people realize in innovation circles in terms of like the applicability of the
Right.
things you learn making cultured cocoa versus say cultured meat or frankly something in biopharma.
Yeah.
Um, like I feel like would it be fair to say like if you went back to biopharma tomorrow for some reason that you would be able to apply, like for example, like cost cutting measures that might make a process more efficient because of what you've had to learn in other spaces.
Absolutely, absolutely, and coming with that new perspective of that we have to really think about the costs and the processes and how can we simplify it for a commodity is very different than when you're thinking about a biopharmaceutical when you have a profit margin that is huge, 10 times larger than what you get in a commodity food product.
So you anticipated what I was going to ask. Like biopharma accepts extremely high costs per
Hmm.
dose because
Right.
arguably health is priceless. Um, So how do you mentally shift from that framework to food where cost accessibility is often the determining factor, margins are super slim? Like what was the
Yeah.
major adjustment that had to happen?
Honestly, it wasn't that hard for me because back in the day when I was working with J&J, one of the first companies I worked with, I was involved in an exercise to with some of the leaders in the programs to reduce our cost of goods for the active pharmaceutical ingredient, that is the drug substance that we purify from the bioreactor. And the goal was to reduce the cost of goods for that pharmaceutical ingredient from $1,000 per gram down to $100 per gram. And at that time, it was huge. I mean, we were really just scratching every area we could to try to understand how to reduce these costs because it was so expensive. But the idea, though, is the food taken and using biotechnology, the same sort of processes that we would use for a biopharmaceutical, and then now use those same processes for a food product where the costs of goods have to be dramatically even lower, was kind of a natural fit for me. So looking at because of my background in working at J&J and doing that exercise, going from $1,000 to $100, and now with food, we're talking about pennies per kilogram. How can we get the cost reduced? And it's an exercise in going through the critical supply chain or the critical path, if you will, in program management lingo, and identifying, where can we reduce the work and what is unnecessary to prove safety and efficacy. And you walk along those paths and understand really where can we save money and do things differently. And you want to be innovative there. And that's where a lot of what I think of still a lot of good innovation is yet to be had in the biopharmaceutical space to drive those costs down.
What do you think, and you may even actually know this, what aspects drive the high, is it a true floor of the high cost in biopharmaceutical production, or is it a convention that we haven't tried or we haven't revisited this well-trodden path because it works, and so the cost could be lower,
Hmm.
but we don't know. Like first off, what tends to drive those high costs in pharma versus food?
Well,
And where's that floor? Is it artificial or is it hard?
no, I think it is truly a hard floor there because, at least with pharmaceuticals, you're always going to have to clinical trials. And clinical trials are extremely expensive and take a lot of time. And they should be because you're involving human subjects. That is going to always contribute to the cost. The other thing is that pharmaceutical companies are taking a huge risk and putting up a huge investment to develop these drugs. The risk is that Um, well, first, let me start with the investment. The investment is in the discovery scientist, making the connection between a disease indication and a modality that they can use to impact that disease. That's all discovery. That's essentially a sunk cost unless you get a drug out of it. And then you go through the clinical trials. And remember, this is a regulated industry, so we have to do things to certain standards. And I know we'll get back to this, but or maybe this will be another drum I'll just continuously bang. Is that I come at this food work with the safety and efficacy perspective that I grew up in biopharmaceuticals. Because if it's not safe and if it's not efficacious, it's not a product. And so then what are we doing? And so, to get back to your original question about the cost of it, I think pharmaceuticals, because they're taking on risk, and that's what the point I wanted to make is that 10% maybe of all drugs make it onto the market. I think it's even less than that for small
Mm.
molecule drugs.
So, would it be fair to say that the some of the lessons you've learned from drug development that may be applicable to food production is in recognizing where those lines things that are immovable that you'll always have to deal with, versus where do you have production, like where can you lower the cost or actually make meaningful differences?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's exactly right, and that's one of the things that I learned early in my career in industrial science with J&J is that you the goal of industrial research should always be producing safe and efficacious products that help customers and that they're profitable. And if they're not profitable, then you're not going to have a product. And so those three things are the things that really keep in mind and that I learned early on and then carried forward. The other thing is, as a technical leader, you have to master both the business processes as well as the technology to be able to explain the business strategy as well as the technical roadmaps to getting to produce the products for that strategy is really important. And then finally, going back to the other risks that, the pharmaceutical companies are taking on is that it takes a village to get a product to the market. And I learned that, really closely in the pharmaceutical space because it would take 10 years to get a drug from discovery or conception onto the market. And as I said, only 10% of the time that would be successful. So it takes a lot of people, and not one person can do everything on the critical path from discovery onto commercialization. And you have to build those collaborative relationships.
that sparks a question because I really like the way you're thinking about this. It's a hypothetical, and I know a lot of people would say, "Well, there's probably drugs, functional foods, pick your thing that would be very good for humanity, but because it's not a profitable business, we'll never see it, or we don't, it
Hmm.
might be a long time, and that feels morally icky to say, well, um, we're not going to do that. But so my question is like, if on average it's 1 to 2 billion all in for a pharma company to take a small molecule from idea to on market
Right.
and the total spend, if it were, let's say, $100 million or 10, it wouldn't be 10 million, but let's say 10 million. Do you think we would have better foods, better drugs? Would that? How do you think that changes the calculus for you? Or do you think like it would be the opposite? Maybe we would see a flood of not as good. Like where do you think
Well,
that cost would get
it,
absorbed?
I always tip my hat to you and other regulators in the FDA because that is what's going to keep us from backsliding into, snake oil. But I
I
absolutely
I
agree.
agree, by the way, but
Yes.
I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. But I absolutely agree. We need to have more shots on goal. And the only way to do that is to reduce the cost of the processes. And that's why I like to think of myself. I kind of grew up as a molecular biologist, studied microbial uh, um, pathology. Sorry. And, but now I think of myself as a process scientist. How can we do things faster and cheaper and get the same data faster and better data so we can produce products that are going to be beneficial? And I like to think about there may be orphan drugs out there that have been left behind because they've not been profitable. But there may be a future where those drugs are revived because we have new processes to make them profitable.
Well, that dovetailing on that is, I'm curious how your relationship with your work's sort of moral weight has changed as you've moved from treating disease to creating food. And I do mean creating food,
Hmm.
designing food, if you will. It's almost additive manufacturing at this point, like 3D printing. Does does saving lives feel different from feeding people? And if not, I'd love to understand that. But I'm curious, you've lived so much in both worlds. How does that change your moral calculus as you approach this work?
So, yeah, I mean, creating medicines and working in drug discovery and drug development and seeing drugs make it to the market that I've worked on is hugely motivating. And I've always been very pleased to be part of an industry where, the people are there to work not for the paycheck, but for the moral obligation to help other people, and be it in health or in food. But I think with my transition into food, it's become a little bit more personal in that everyone loves and appreciates food. It sustains us. It's part of our culture. It's part of our society. And where I think in pharmaceuticals, I was impacting people, or maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Here with my work in food and your work in food, we have the potential to impact millions of people, if not billions, if we get it right. So that's a little bit more motivating for me. It also doesn't make the challenges any less daunting, but it makes it easier to get up in the morning and go to work.
I think I think we've talked about this in the past, but I've said on this show too. I think that it's a virtuous cycle between biopharma and cultured foods of all
Hmm.
types. That the innovations of one feed the next generation of innovations in the other. We're already seeing that the things we've learned in cultivated and cultured products making its way back into biopharma for lower
Right.
cost new approaches. Um, and I think that's only going to just feed right back into cultured products.
Yep.
So I think that's very much the case. Um, and I think this also gets to, and I'm curious what you think around something, the meaning of quote unquote real food. Like now that we can create plant tissues and animal tissues without traditional agriculture,
Yeah.
are we? Is that does that constitute redefining food at a fundamental level? I personally don't think so. I think if anything, we are reinforcing the identity of a food,
Hmm.
um,
Interesting.
and in that um, we are bridging our cultural past to our present and future. Like we want to keep eating this thing, the cocoa powder,
Right.
meat, and we're just trying to recapitulate that. But I'm curious what you think. Maybe you disagree or have a different viewpoint.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I like that perspective that you just said about reaffirming our cultural touchstones, what we like about the foods that we eat. And, let's take chocolate for an example. Um, we've been eating chocolate for the last 5,300 years. So over 5,000 years, I know that. And I think I read that there was a scientific evidence of cocoa production 5,300 years ago. So in the context, we don't know what real food is anymore. And that's where I would argue that it's great to have this touchstone of what we think is important in a food, but also recognize that for the last 12,000 years, we've been changing the food systems in a very fundamental way, um, across the board. So you could take any food that we eat today. Corn is a perfect example. Corn cob, that big thing, is totally unrecognizable to what it started out as, back in Mesoamerica, more than 10,000 years ago, which, teosinte is the original plant that it came from. Its cob is smaller than a child's finger. So, through selective breeding and propagation, we've created this monster out of nature that we now rely on not only for consumption, but we create biofuel from it and we feed it to our animals. Um, but it's totally indistinguishable from what was natural. That gets to my point, and here I'm no food historian or philosopher, but we give importance to food because food is important. And so we build traditions and cultures around it. And we like to have that touch connection with our foods. And so, in that sense, I think we as consumers are the ones that are going to define what is real. And that reality is always going to be changing as we innovate new foods and our tastes change or our cultures change. So there may be one, shark fin soup, is not a food in some cultures where it's a very sought after delicacy in other cultures. So there's that societal part that is very interesting to think about when you're talking about how our food systems and our foodstuffs have changed over time.
I agree, and I feel like most people listening probably hear science and innovation are often posited in sci-fi tropes as like it's the reason things went wrong.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's never the reason things went right, or it's very
Right.
rarely, or
Yeah.
better than we could have hoped. Um, because I think that partially doesn't make for as good a story, but I'd argue it does. For example, like the work that you're doing is meaningfully trying to continue a deep human tradition with a foodstuff that has been consumed by many, many, many humans on this planet for thousands of years, and we want to continue doing so. Despite that, what the climate may be changing. And I just feel like science here is trying to create bridges to our traditions, which
Hmm.
feels oxymoronic,
Right.
antithetical to like what science does. But I actually think we're doing the opposite. We're building a bridge.
I love that perspective because if you think about chocolate, I mean, it's been used in medicine, it's been used in religion, it's been a foodstuff forever. And we're basically going to be destroying our planet trying to continue to grow cocoa as it has
Mm.
been grown over the last 5,000 years. How can we create a food system whereby we don't have to have the dramatic impact on the environment that we're currently having and still support the population? That's where I think we really need to understand that, yes, we need to continue industrializing our food system. We need to increase the yields from every aspect, be it traditional agriculture or cellular agriculture that we're talking about today. But continuing to redefine what is real, what is traditional, is going to be very important because food is so central to everything that we do in our society and our traditions.
With an eye towards your experience in cultivated meats and growing meat and now growing cacao, do you see your work as working with nature, or is there an element of transcending it? Like, do you have a distinction in your mind? And I know most scientists don't think about this, but I think you're
Yeah.
the type of person that does. So
Yeah.
I'm curious what you do think.
Well, going back to the idea of, food as medicine, and our lead product is, falls in that line. So I see us as we have to transcend nature in this arena, at least in the food space. We need to produce more appealing, nutritionally better for us foodstuffs, and we have the capabilities to do that now. We're only seeing the beginnings of it, but the pushback that we're seeing is concerning, but also we need to remember that we're in the very early beginnings of what is going to be a revolutionary technology with engineering our foods to be fit for purpose and highly effective and cost effective.
And you bring up a great point. As of today, Texas passed its ban. The state of Texas here in the United States passed its ban on cultivated meat. It's we're seeing more and more of these types of bans occur. And by the way, there's you can't buy cultivated meat in Texas. It has never existed to my knowledge there.
Right.
So it was preemptively banned yet again, despite having multiple major endorsements of safety by multiple government agencies on multiple products. Arguably, and I've said this in the past, cultured meat and I assume cultured cocoa will be
Hmm.
the most studied and in terms of safety, the most studied product ever to be consumed by humans.
Right.
So, is this just sort of the latest tired old trope of what's natural is better? And not knowing that and I do mean everything was invented or optimized by a human to be better for humans in the last 10,000 years. It's like that is the meaning of domestication. It's made for humans,
Right.
and I think in many plants it's in the last 500 years.
Yep.
So, said differently, everything we eat, every bean, grain, steak, wing, fillet, was at some point recently the most amazing human invention we've ever had up to that point. It's an
Right.
ode to our curiosity.
Exactly.
So, what's going on then, in your opinion? Like, why do you think we're getting this pushback? Why do you think we're seeing this?
Well, if we go back to one of the lessons I learned from my first postdoc at J&J is, food or any product needs to be safe, efficacious, and profitable. We work in a capitalistic society, and sometimes the profit margin is, I would say, um, more valued than safety and efficacy. And I think what we're seeing here is essentially the traditional agriculture lobbyist getting the ears of politicians to essentially take the choice away from consumers. So we know that the Cattlemen's Association, the ranchers, have funded a smear campaign to sway the consumer on cultivated meat. And that has really done us a huge disservice because the future is, in some fashion, that we have to do this technology. If we're going to grow our population to 8, 9 billion people, we have to do things differently. And so, unfortunately, I see this as just another example where, corporate greed is line the pockets of politicians to pass um, legislation again against the public's own interest and misinformation, propagating this misinformation. Because you're absolutely right, this is the safest food that has ever been produced, and or maybe not the safest. I mean, it's a bit hyperbole, but from a regulatory and a safety perspective, I think the cautions are completely overblown, and the concerns. And yeah, I think it's really a disservice to all of us by these politicians weighing in a market that is not even established yet.
I mean, it is. I mean, I would say these are the most studied foods ever, and I think in the context of safety, might make them. That I mean, like I don't think any conventional piece of meat, and again, I love conventional meat, has
Hmm.
ever been subject to this level of safety scrutiny ever.
Right, right,
And I don't know if
and
it would hold up if it were. Like, we might have a very different viewpoint on it if we were to subject it to this to similar degree of testing.
right, 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 right.
But
And
that
then,
said, oh, go
yeah,
ahead, please.
oh, no, go ahead with yours.
I was going to say, like, modifying genes, like changing genes, is literally what I think humans are best at. We are so good at intuiting genetics from the things that we care about: animals, plants, whatever, fungus, bacteria. We're very good at getting the best out of something, even if it still has bad genes coming along with it. One, I think that I'm curious if you would disagree with that statement. But two, in the context of our ability to manipulate genes, one, are you manipulating any of the genes in your product in any direct way or indirect way? And do you think there's going to be less of a yuck factor with cultured cocoa in general, because it's not an animal product and it's not
Yeah.
a living thing? I'm curious what you think to all that. Feel free to take that in any way you'd like.
Well, that sounded like three different questions. So help me remember and get back to them all. So yeah, I mean, you're talking to a molecular biologist, so absolutely, I agree with you. Yeah, humans are very good at modifying genetics, and we've done this for years and years. And just now, do we have the true understanding of what's going on in our selective breeding processes? And we have the tools through innovation and technology to be able to go in and actually modify some of those metabolisms to produce better products. And that's the beauty. And that's what I hope is going to be the third or fourth agricultural revolution, which will be genetic modification. Now, our product is not genetic modification. We understand that there is a backlash, and we want to use the natural diversity that we're uncovering in the cacao genome and isolate cell lines that have that plasticity or that genetic encoding for the phenotypes or the characteristics that we know will go into a good product. So we're not modifying our cell lines as of yet, but relying on the natural diversity found in nature to select for the candidates and the cell lines that have the good features that we're after. So, what was the last part of their question?
The yuck factor. Do you
Yeah.
think it's going to be similar to cultured meat, or different, or same? Or what are you hearing? What are you seeing?
So, yeah, I like to think that plant cell culture is going to have less of a yuck factor. I mean, clearly we have some issues with cultivated meat, and we can talk about the literature and the surveys about people's dislike of that idea. But people are, when they're given a novel food product, if it's plant based, they are much more likely to accept it and willingness to try and return purchase. Um, and I think part of that is because, people understand that plants have always been processed into other things. You think of milk, taking soybeans and making milk from it. It's a very popular product, and people understand that you can process plants into many different things, including fabrics. So we have plants throughout our lives. I also like to think that what we're doing in the lab with plant cellular agriculture is very similar to planting a seed in a garden and getting a tomato plant at the end. It's not that far from the reality. And then the last thing is on the yuck factor. I think, the products that we're going to be going after with plant cell culture are much simpler and not as complicated as you would say a chicken nugget or a piece of steak, where you do have different tissue types interplaying to give you that mouthfeel and that real great taste. So the first plant products are probably going to be like cocoa powder, packed full of flavor and good for you, but basically a powder. So it doesn't reconnect back to the animal or um, traditional agriculture.
Speaking of, what what aspects of the fundamental science have been the most fascinating to you to see firsthand? When move it from biopharma to cultured meat and now in
Yeah.
cultured cocoa. Like, what are there trends? Are there themes that you're seeing, or things that are just unique to each that you find fascinating?
Well, to geek out a little bit, I mean, just totally amazed in our ability to increase biomass or protein titers. The amount of or the yield that we're able to get out of these cells dramatically increased over the last 20 years. And I've been just really honored to be part of that and to see it. So I think we're going to continue seeing that push to improve our yields, but we're going to then start moving into, can we make it more appealing? Can we make it more nutritious? And that's where I think the fun will really begin. And the new products that will come out that will still be, connected to our traditions, but then better for us and feed more people.
Yeah, I've never understood why there's sort of some of the weirdness to what we do, because like we constantly try to improve the yields of animals' bodies,
Right.
literally their entire existed plants, the exact same thing. And now, and I think what you're saying is we're at the cellular level. Each cell, we're improving its productivity.
Hmm.
Is that fair to say? And you're
Yep.
not just speaking about, even animal or plant, but also even biopharma, like cells used to make vaccines and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. Yep. 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 Sorry, I wasn't clear on that, but yeah, the yield from biopharma is increased. When I started, it was, we were happy to get 100 mgs per liter, and now we're, very typical for a standard antibody to get 10 grams per liter. So that stepfold increase, we're also able to see that also in the biomass.
And for our Freedom Unit loving audience, that was a tenfold increase in productivity. Uh, I promise, Steve and I use 350 Fahrenheit on our ovens. We don't we
Exactly.
don't always go 180C for everything. Although
Yeah.
I do find myself telling people as a scientist that, as an American, that literally the only part of my life I don't think I do metric in is baking, like, or
Oh,
baking temperature, like the baking
uh-huh.
temperature. The oven temperature's got to be 350 Fahrenheit. I have to do Fahrenheit. I don't know about you.
Yeah, cooking, yes, is imperial. But the other thing I was, my neighbor was just giving me a hard time about is using imperial measurements in woodworking. So construction, I think, is still inches and feet.
Yeah, you need to cut that dimension that lumber to 17 inches and
Right.
5/16
Right.
of a fraction of the knuckle on your third finger, because that's what we did in the 1500s when people lived to 40 years old.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, so, um, obviously, both of us living in two different worlds. The Do you, getting back to the food and the pharma, I think what's fascinating about you and your career to me and part of this interview is just like, again, you've lived in so many different worlds, and trying to learn from all of them. Are there trade-offs in your mind between solving like immediate problems like food security versus, preserving certain agricultural practices that connect us to, our tradition? Or do you think that, you know, some of these new things we're doing can help us build new traditions, and traditions got to start somewhere?
Well, I think the human trajectory is one of change. And, we have got to accept that things are going to continue changing and we have to have more shots on goal, like we talked about earlier, but also that the traditional ways are going to continue to be there. It's not like we're going to forget how to grow crops in the next 10 years. But we have to give ourselves more opportunities to understand that traditional farming has its uses, also its drawbacks, and it's been terribly messy considering how we've over fertilized the planet in some places and really caused, ecological disasters in other places. But farming can be improved and it needs to be improved. At the same time, we have to look at other ways to grow food for ourselves because, the reality is if we don't do this, we're going to be facing starvation and malnutrition. And, luckily for us here in the, developed countries, that will be, not so harmful as it is in the more developing countries. And, there's some research saying that actually that is wrong, that the more developed countries are going to suffer more from this change in our next 50 years. And the developing countries are a little bit more scrappy and can, adapt to those different environments and grow different foods faster than the developing countries. So either way, we have to have more shots on goals. We have to have innovation. We have to have people studying the traditional ways and improving on that. And we need to just generally figure out how to generate more food for everyone on this planet without destroying the planet.
Yeah, more food using less stuff. That's what I tell people. More food using less stuff. If we
It's
can do
increased the
that,
yield.
that's right. That's right.
Yep,
Efficiency. Well, that's
exactly.
it. Like, where's food heading? I'm not asking you to predict the future, but I mean, just like you've lived at the bleeding edge for so long now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a different, slightly different vantage point. Where's food innovation taking us? Where do you see it going?
I don't know. But
Good answer. That's what a scientist
yeah,
should say.
yeah. But let me tell you what concerns me, and I'll use some um, media references. So I understand recently there's been a movie called Mickey 17 that came out where uh, cultivated food was a big part of it, or it was a part of the storyline, and the masses were fed this glop that was cultivated, and only the elite and the super wealthy were evidently allowed to have the traditionally farmed foodstuffs. That's not the future I want. And I think for you and me, that same trope, that same story was Soylent Green, where everything was turned into Soylent Green, fed to the masses, and only the very rich could actually have farm raised strawberries. That's not the future that I want for anyone. And we need to be developing biotech food that is healthy, nutritious, and people enjoy it and see it more than just slop. Because right now, where I see us, and this is what concerns me. This is what really concerns me is that we are more likely, in surveys, we are more likely to give cultivated meat to our pets than eat it ourselves. And this may be a death knell to me for cultivated meat because we have to get beyond that because it has to be part of our future if we want to be eating meat. Likewise with chocolate. If we want chocolate in the future, we have to think of novel ways to do it. And we like to also, I like to think about, maybe setting up a station in Mars or on the moon. You don't want to take a cacao plant with you or a cow to have your chocolate and your hamburger. And so, how are we going to do that? And so, maybe getting back to your original question is what does the future of food look like? Really, it looks like science fiction, and it should be. We need to have replicators in our kitchens that produce hamburgers for us from carbon dioxide that's captured from the air, rather than raising animals 2 years to put on all the meat and then take them to this process that is not very good for them or us.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think I've said I interviewed Mike Grunwald, who was on the show recently, his new book, and I was
I
like,
like that.
we need more science in our food.
Yeah.
That if you want the tastiest food, we need more science. And to those that may be listening, like, no, well, Eric, what about ultra processed food? I'm not shying away from. We've
Right.
used food science, certain aspects to produce foods that are likely not very good for us in the long run. However, net overall, science and human innovation has produced more calories, healthy calories for humans to allow us to get to 9 billion people, and on our way to 10.
Exactly.
So I don't see a world where less science in our food produces more efficient products that can feed more people that people enjoy and what have you. I want to keep eating things I love. And I know you
Yep.
do too, Steve. So,
Yeah, I do.
like, in order to do that, we got to put more science in it because we're not creating more earth.
Right.
We have less earth to work with to produce those foods. And otherwise, you're right, it'll be soylent. I noticed,
Yep.
by the way, you did not bring up the cloning aspect of Mickey 17
Oh,
if you haven't seen the movie, because
I,
the premise is that he's the 17th iteration of a clone of the original Mickey. So I just want to note, I'm not putting you on the spot to talk about whether human cloning will be acceptable, because I didn't ask you about that, and certainly not food. But I do want to note for our listeners that he definitely did not mention what he felt about human cloning.
well, thank you.
Wink,
Like I said,
wink, nod, nod.
yeah, I have not seen the movie yet. I'm looking forward to it, though.
um, okay. So do you? This is sort of. I'd love to end the show with your thoughts on. Do you envision a future where the lines between food and medicine blur through biotechnology? Should they? And related, what collaborations or convergences do you think are being overlooked right now in those two sectors, or in general?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that food and medicine, those Venn diagrams should be overlapping. Not for everything, but for certain situations, yes, absolutely. And I like to think about our cocoa powder with the high flavanol content. That is a perfect example where you can supplement your nutrition with something that's going to help your health in the long run. And I think we should just look for more opportunities like that and build in nutraceuticals into our foodstuffs. It's like, I even know this has become controversial, putting fluoride into the water. The positives far outweigh the negatives, and yeah, so we can talk about that too. But let's see, what was your last question? Sorry.
Any of these collaborations or
Oh,
convergences do you think that are being overlooked that really should exist?
yeah, I mean, the biggest frustration for me and collaborations is this idea that and defining cellular agriculture as just cultivated meat. Yes, I agree that cultivated meat is the biggest problem we've got to solve in our food system. Or meat consumption is the biggest problem we've got to solve in our food system right now. But it needs to begin with eating less meat and coming up with alternatives that are just as healthy. But the problem is that we're losing a lot of good science and particularly around plant cell culture and using these same processes but different cells coming from plants and exploring that. So that's the type of collaboration and the funding that I think we're really lacking in the food system right now, or food innovation. Um, um, if, uh, yeah, food innovation world is that we need to have more plant cell culture funding and collaborations and looking for products that we can produce from plant cells rather than just focusing on these animal cell products.
The most important question: when do you expect us to be able to purchase California cultured cocoa powder?
So we're a B2B company, so it'll be an ingredient, and we're hoping to be on the market sometimes in 2026. We'll be submitting a dossier here this summer for generally recognized as safe through the regulatory authorities of FDA, and then we're building up our production right now. So very excited about all of these things that we're working on. You know, the low capex, low opex bioreactors, as well as then getting the scaling done.
Well, I'm very excited for you and California Cultured. I just want to thank you not only for being on the show, but of course for all the work that you've done for cellular agriculture, and that you continue to do. We are better off because you've been a part of this field so far.
Well, I really appreciate that. Say the same for
So
you.
I just want to say thank you again for being on Food Truth, Steve. Dr. Steve Lang is again the Vice President of Science and Technology at Sacramento-based California Cultured, where they're making cultivated cocoa. If you want more information about Steve and California Cultured, you can look in the show notes below. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like to be addressed here, feel free to reach out directly. I'm your host, Eric Schulze. See you next time on Food Truths here on the Spoon Podcast Network.
Thanks so much.